If you do not want to move into assisted living, then pack your things and leave my house. That was what my son said, standing in his kitchen looking straight through me like I was already gone. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I just nodded and smiled faintly the way you do when you realize a decision has already been made without you. I went downstairs to the small basement room they called mine and began folding my clothes carefully, one shirt at a time, like a man finishing his last day of work. I tucked away old photographs, straightened a drawer that no one would open again, and closed my suitcase. Somewhere upstairs, I heard my daughter-in-law whispering on the phone, mentioning a place called Silver Pines and an appointment for next week, as if my life had already been scheduled. They gave me 1 hour, an hour to disappear quietly. Exactly 1 hour later, a black limousine pulled up in front of the house. When my son opened the door and saw who had come to pick me up, the color drained from his face. In that moment, I realized the hardest part was not being told to leave. It was standing there looking at the child I once taught to walk and understanding that he no longer knew who I was. What I did not realize then was that this was not an argument, it was a decision already made without me. The dishwasher had been running so long, it sounded like the house was grinding its teeth. I stood at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee that had gone cold, watching a light March rain darken the concrete driveway. The neighborhood in Naperville was quiet, the kind of quiet built on routines and early alarms. Porch lights still on. Cars parked in the same spots every night. This was my son's house. Brick 2 stories, trimmed hedges. Solid. Dependable. Everything I had once believed family was supposed to be. I had been living here since 2019. That was the year I sold my townhouse in Oak Park, the one I had paid off inch by inch over 3 decades of construction work. Bridges, foundations, municipal projects that still stood long after the crews packed up and moved on. I sold that place because my wife had been gone 2 years, and silence had started to feel heavier than noise. Tyler told me it made sense. "You'll be closer to us, Dad. We've got room." Room turned out to be the basement, a converted office with a narrow window at ground level. I could see shoes go by when someone walked outside. I never complained. Men like me are trained not to. That morning felt different before anyone said a word. I had already wiped down the counters and set out cereal bowls the way Paige liked them arranged. Paige was my daughter-in-law. 38, smart, efficient, always moving like she was late for something important. I had learned her habits the way you learn the timing of traffic lights. Her phone buzzing on the counter. The citrus smell of her hand lotion when she passed behind me. Tyler came in first. He wasn't wearing his jacket yet, just a button-down shirt, and that tight expression he used to get as a teenager when he knew he was about to ask for something he had no right to expect. He sat at the island and stared at his hands. Paige followed him in and leaned against the doorway. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. She was already positioned where she could see both of us. Emma padded in last, her backpack slipping off one shoulder. She reached for the cereal, then stopped when she felt it. "Mom, are we late?" Paige's voice softened. "No, sweetheart. Go finish getting ready." Emma looked at me, then at her father, and went upstairs. Her footsteps faded. The kitchen felt too big without her. Tyler cleared his throat. "Dad, we need to talk." I nodded. "All right." Paige walked closer to the counter. She turned her phone face down and folded her arms. That small movement told me more than words ever could. Tyler started slow. "Things are expensive right now. The house, the taxes, everything. We have to think ahead." I waited. I had spent most of my life managing projects. I knew when someone was circling the truth because it was heavy. Emma's getting older, he said. School costs, activities, and you're not getting any younger. There it was. The sentence people use when they want permission to move you out of the way. I took a sip of coffee. Burnt. Bitter. Paige watched my face like she was waiting for a crack. We've been talking about what's best for everyone, Tyler said. Everyone usually means everyone but the person being discussed. What do you mean? I asked. He looked past me toward the window. There are places, assisted living communities. They're clean, safe, people your age. You wouldn't have to worry about stairs or maintenance or any of that. I set the mug down carefully. You're talking about a nursing home. Tyler shook his head too fast. Not like that. It's not what you're thinking. Paige finally spoke, her voice calm and controlled. Frank, this house isn't set up for this stage of life. The basement stairs, the bathroom. Emma needs space. Tyler needs peace when he gets home. Peace. As if I were static on a radio. I looked at my hands. Veins raised. Skin thinner than it used to be. These hands had poured concrete in winter and steadied steel in summer heat. They had held my wife's hand when she could no longer speak. I had earned the right to decide where I lived, I said quietly. I sold my home to help you build yours. I moved here so you wouldn't have to worry about me. I have not asked for anything except respect. Paige's jaw tightened. She glanced at Tyler and gave the slightest nod, a signal so small most people would miss it. I didn't. Tyler stood up. The chair scraped the floor. Dad, don't make this harder than it has to be. His voice rose not with sadness, but with irritation. Either you enter a nursing home or you leave my house. The words landed and stayed. I noticed details the way I always do when something breaks. The hum of the refrigerator. A smear on the sink I had cleaned the night before. Paige's fingers tightening around her phone. Tyler's hands shaking not from guilt, but from frustration that I wasn't agreeing. For a moment, no one moved. I nodded once. All right. Tyler blinked like he had expected a fight. I'll pack my things. Paige exhaled. Relief crossed her face before she caught it. We can talk about places, Tyler said quickly. We can look this week. I didn't answer. I walked past them toward the basement door. Behind me, Tyler said my name. I stopped at the railing. Give me an hour, I said. I'll be out. I didn't wait to hear footsteps behind me. I went down the basement stairs at the same pace I always used, slow enough not to rush, steady enough not to show hesitation. The wood creaked under my weight, familiar sounds that had become part of my nights. Halfway down, I rested my hand on the railing. It felt solid. I focused on that. Solid things had always calmed me. The basement smelled faintly of laundry detergent and cardboard. My room sat at the end of the narrow hallway, past the washer and dryer, and the shelves stacked with labeled bins. Christmas, tools, old books, evidence of lives stored away until someone decided what to keep. I closed the door behind me and stood still for a moment. The room was small but neat. Twin bed pressed against the wall. A narrow dresser. A folding chair that had never quite found its purpose. The only window sat near the ceiling, letting in a slice of gray daylight and the occasional shadow of shoes passing by outside. I lived underground in more ways than one. I moved to the wall above the dresser, where I kept the few things that still felt like mine. There were the rolled blueprints, edges yellowed and soft, tied together with twine. the first bridge I had supervised back in the late 90s outside Aurora. I remembered standing there before dawn breath visible in the cold, watching the river move under the temporary supports. That bridge was still there. People drove over it every day without knowing my name. That had always been enough. Next to it was a small engineer's pin, dulled with age, a banquet souvenir. I had never cared for ceremonies, but I kept it anyway. Proof that someone somewhere once acknowledged the work. And the photograph. 1998. A ribbon cutting. Officials in clean coats, hands that had never held a shovel. I stood off to the side with my hard hat tucked under my arm. The bridge filled the background. Strong. Finished. I remembered thinking that day that building something solid was the closest thing to immortality a man like me would ever get. I pulled my suitcase from under the bed and set it on top, then unzipped it. The sound felt louder than it should have. Upstairs, the house was quiet. Not tense, just active in small ways. A drawer opening, a cabinet closing, the low hum of conversation muffled by distance. Life moving forward. I folded my clothes slowly. Shirts first. Jeans. The gray sweater I wore to church on Christmas Eve, even when I didn't feel like sitting through the service. I packed as if I were leaving for a short trip, not being told to remove myself from my own family. I wasn't shocked. That surprised me. But the truth was the conversation upstairs hadn't come out of nowhere. It had been building for months, maybe longer. Paige correcting me when I called it our house. Tyler checking his phone instead of meeting my eyes when money came up. The way they talked about my health, like it was a shared project they needed to manage. I paused and glanced at the clock on my phone. 22 minutes had passed. I reached into the dresser drawer and pulled out a small envelope. Inside were a few photos I had printed myself. Emma at a 4th of July parade, face-painted flag in her hand. Tyler holding her on his shoulders. Paige smiling beside them. I remembered standing behind the phone, framing the shot, making sure everyone else was in focus. I slid the envelope into the suitcase. That was when I heard Paige's voice. It drifted down from the kitchen, low and measured. I couldn't make out every word, but the tone was unmistakable. Efficient, businesslike. I stood still, one sock in my hand, and listened. I heard a name cut through the air. Silver Pines. She said it the way people say the name of a restaurant they've already decided on. Then I heard appointment. Then next week. Something tightened in my chest. Silver Pines wasn't just a place. It was a plan. I sat down on the edge of the bed. The room didn't spin. I wasn't dizzy. I just needed to sit with the weight of it. This hadn't been a sudden decision made in the heat of frustration. They had already started scheduling my absence. For a moment I considered going upstairs, asking directly, forcing the conversation into the open. My hand flexed on the sock. Then I stopped myself. If they were already making calls, then the answers I would get upstairs would be rehearsed, smoothed over, wrapped in concern and language about what was best. I stayed where I was. Another memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. Thomas Reed. 70 years old now, if he was still alive. A foreman I had worked with for over a decade. Stubborn, proud. The kind of man who never asked for help. After his wife died, his kids convinced him to move closer. Just for a while, they said. I visited him once at a facility outside Joliet. The place smelled of disinfectant and overcooked vegetables. Thomas sat by a window staring at a parking lot. His shirt was tucked in, his hair combed. His eyes looked far away. He smiled when he saw me, then lowered his voice. Frank, don't stay too long. They don't like it when you remind people they still have a life. I asked when he was going home. He shrugged and said, when my daughter decides. 2 months later, I called the facility. They told me he had been transferred. Privacy policy. No address. No number. I called his daughter. Voicemail. A week later, the line was disconnected. Last night, I had dreamed of him tapping on glass like he was underwater. I woke up with my heart racing and told myself it meant nothing. Now I knew better. I checked the time again. 41 minutes. I stood up and finished packing. Not faster. More deliberately. I took the photograph from the wall and slid it between my sweaters. I rolled the blueprints tighter and retied the twine. Those stayed with me. The pin went into my pocket. Upstairs, footsteps moved toward the front of the house. Tyler, I guessed, checking the clock, making sure I stayed on schedule. I zipped the suitcase closed. The sound was final. I looked around the room one last time. The bed smoothed, the chair empty. No trace of a life, just a space waiting for the next thing to be stored. I wrapped my hand around the suitcase handle and took a breath. 58 minutes. Somewhere above me, the doorbell rang. The sound of the doorbell carried through the house with a weight that felt heavier than it should have. I stepped out of the basement and into the kitchen, the suitcase rolling behind me. Tyler stood near the front door, his hand hovering, as if he wasn't sure whether to open it or pretend he hadn't heard anything. Paige was a few feet back, arms folded, her posture calm in a way that felt rehearsed. The bell rang again. Tyler pulled the door open. For a moment, no one spoke. Cool air slipped into the house, bringing with it the smell of wet pavement and early spring. What stood at the curb didn't belong to this street. Not here, not among the minivans and sedans lined up like obedient thoughts. A long black limousine waited quietly, its surface reflecting the gray sky. The driver stepped out first. Dark suit, clean movements, eyes forward. He opened the rear door without looking around, as if he had already done this hundreds of times. Then a man stepped onto the sidewalk. Michael Grant stood straighter than most men half his age. Silver hair neatly combed, coat buttoned, shoes polished, but not flashy. He didn't hesitate, didn't scan the house number, didn't ask for confirmation. He walked up the driveway like he knew exactly where he was meant to be. Tyler's face drained of color. Paige's mouth parted, then closed again. Her hand tightened around her phone. Michael reached the porch and stopped just short of the threshold. He didn't rush. He didn't smile. He let the silence sit between us for a breath longer than comfort allowed. Then his eyes found mine. "Frank," he said. "Just my name. It is time." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't explain himself. The words weren't an invitation. They were a marker, like a line drawn in the dirt. Tyler swallowed and stepped forward. "Mr. Grant, what is this about?" Michael didn't look at him. Not out of disrespect, out of certainty. I tightened my grip on the suitcase handle. Something inside me shifted, quiet and firm. This wasn't rescue. It was alignment. A door opening that I had been standing in front of longer than I wanted to admit. I nodded once. "Michael." Paige moved closer, her tone smoothing itself into reason. "Sir Frank is leaving. We are handling this privately, as a family matter." Michael turned his head just enough to acknowledge her presence. "That decision was not yours to make." her cheeks flushed. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, recalculating. Tyler's voice sharpened the edge of panic creeping in. "Dad, what did you do?" I didn't answer right away. I lifted the suitcase and took a step forward. Tyler instinctively shifted to block my path, then froze when he noticed the driver still standing at the curb, hands folded, expression neutral but alert. I walked past my son without touching him. I didn't look at his face. I couldn't afford to. If I saw the boy, he used to be the one who followed me around job sites asking questions, my feet might slow. Hesitation had cost me enough already. The porch boards were damp beneath my shoes. The rain had thinned to a mist. Michael walked beside me close enough to signal solidarity, far enough to respect my space. Behind us, Tyler followed, his voice rising as curtains across the street shifted. "Dad, wait. Talk to me." "Where are you going?" Paige stayed in the doorway. Her silence spoke louder than his confusion. I stopped at the edge of the porch and turned just enough to meet my son's eyes. For the first time since the kitchen, I held his gaze. "You gave me an hour," I said. "I used it." His brow furrowed, still trying to regain control of a situation that had slipped beyond him. I added quietly, "You don't get to schedule my life like an appointment." Behind him, Paige's thumb was already moving across her phone, shaping the moment into whatever version she planned to sell later. I turned away. The driver opened the limousine door. I stepped inside and sat down, setting the suitcase at my feet. The interior smelled of clean leather and something subtle, wood or citrus, the scent of order. Michael followed and closed the door himself, a small act that told me this hadn't been impulsive. Through the tinted window, I watched Tyler stand on the porch, his hands half raised, caught between anger and disbelief. Paige leaned in close to him now, speaking low, her face tight, already moving on to the next strategy. The car pulled away smoothly. The house shrank as we moved down the street. The porch light. The window where I had stood with cold coffee that morning. From the road, it looked smaller, less like a home, and more like a structure I had been allowed to occupy until I was no longer convenient. Michael stared ahead, silent, giving me space. After a block or two, he spoke. "You were right to keep your documents. I need to know where you put them." I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the words settle in. As the neighborhood disappeared behind us, I understood that the hour had ended. What lay ahead wasn't escape. It was reckoning. The city settled around us the way it always does, indifferent and steady. By the time the car eased into midtown traffic, the neighborhood I had just left already felt like something from another life. Michael's building sat between two office towers that looked older than they were quiet places that didn't advertise themselves. Inside there was no rush, no greeting, just a desk, a camera, and the low hum of an elevator that had carried 1,000 private decisions upward. His apartment was simple. Clean lines, worn leather chairs that had earned their creases, a shelf of books on engineering and city planning, the kind you keep because you still respect the work, not because you expect to open them again. From the windows, Manhattan looked distant and organized, like a system that worked whether you were part of it or not. I set my suitcase by the door. "You are safe here," Michael said, not as comfort, but as a statement. I believed him, not because of the building or the view, because of the way he said it. We sat at a small table near the window. He poured coffee into heavy mugs that kept the heat. For a moment, we didn't speak. Silence between us had never been a problem. It was how most of our decisions used to start. Finally, he asked what they knew. Not much, I said. Not everything. That was when I told him about the trust. The one my wife and I put together in 2015 when the doctors were already speaking carefully, and we were still pretending we weren't listening. We did it quietly, without drama. The house in Westchester was never just mine. It belonged to the trust. Tyler was listed as a manager, not an owner. It was meant to protect him. And me. Michael nodded slowly. No surprise. Just confirmation. Then I told him about the power of attorney. Signed it in 2020, I said. I was in the hospital for a few days. Pneumonia. Tyler brought the papers and told me it was routine. Michael's mouth tightened. Routine is how most leverage gets signed. There was a knock at the door before either of us could say more. Michael stood and opened it without hesitation. Daniel Brooks stepped inside with a briefcase tucked under his arm. Mid-50s, neat suit, calm eyes, the kind of man who had learned that panic helped no one. Frank, he said, shaking my hand. I'm sorry it had to happen this way. So am I, said. But I'm glad you're here. Daniel sat across from me and set a folder on the table, leaving it closed. He didn't need props yet. I want to be clear, he said. Your son does not have the authority he believes he has. The power of attorney you signed is limited. It allows assistance. It does not allow him to decide where you live or to move assets for personal benefit. Something eased in my chest. Not relief. Validation. Daniel continued choosing his words carefully. Pressuring or coercing an older parent into assisted living against their will can qualify as elder abuse under Illinois law, especially if there is a financial incentive tied to the decision. The word landed harder than I expected. Elder abuse. I thought of my wife's hands when they shook near the end, how careful I had been not to let anyone else touch her. A cold settled into my fingers. I kept my voice steady. And if they already started planning it? Then we slow everything down, Daniel said, and we learn exactly what they are planning. Michael stood and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. This is not just a family argument, is it? Daniel met my eyes. It may be about removing you from the equation. The room went quiet, not tense, focused. I looked down at my hands. They were steady again. Whatever fear I had carried out of that basement room had begun to organize itself into something sharper. Michael turned back to me. You decide the pace, Frank. Not them. Not me. I appreciated that. I wasn't here to be handed from one authority to another. Daniel cleared his throat. There is one more thing. Michael mentioned a name earlier. Silver Pines. The memory surfaced immediately. Paige's voice in the kitchen. The way she said it, like the decision had already been made. And Thomas Reed sitting by that window, waiting for permission to go home. I told Daniel what I heard. The call. The appointment. The timing. Daniel listened without interrupting. Silver Pines has appeared in a few files, he said when I finished. Complaints. Families arguing about decisions made too quickly. Nothing dramatic. Just patterns. Michael exhaled slowly. Patterns are where the truth hides. Daniel nodded. We do not accuse, we do not confront without facts, we gather information. I felt the weight of the moment settle. Not fear. Responsibility. I spoke before anyone else could. I want to see it. Daniel raised an eyebrow. See what? The place they were ready to send me to, I said. Silver Pines. I want to walk through the front door myself. Michael studied me for a moment. Not to test me. To measure resolve. All right, he said. Then we will know what we are dealing with. Outside the window, the city moved on unbothered by family fractures or legal boundaries. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug and stared down at the grid below, knowing that whatever waited for me next would decide more than where I slept. Silver Pines sat farther out than I expected, past strip malls and medical offices in that quiet stretch of road, where everything looks temporary, even when it has been there for years. The sign at the entrance was tasteful brushed metal, with clean lettering framed by trimmed hedges and a wide lawn that looked like someone's idea of peace. If you drove by without thinking, you might have believed it was a place people chose. That was the first lie. I parked a little way down, took a breath, and walked in alone. No Daniel. No Michael. No warning that I was anything other than another older man trying to be responsible. I wanted to see what they showed a person before the paperwork started. I wanted to see how a place like this made itself feel inevitable. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and something sweet trying to cover it, vanilla or cinnamon, like a candle burning in a room where someone had been sick. The lobby was bright but quiet. Couches arranged in neat squares, a fish tank bubbling softly with two pale fish circling each other in slow motion. A television mounted high on the wall played a daytime game show at low volume. The laughter track sounded distant, like it belonged to another building. A woman at the front desk looked up with a practiced smile. "Can I help you?" I told her I was looking around, that I was considering options. My voice came out even. She nodded as if she had heard the sentence 100 times that week. "Of course, take your time. Let me know if you have any questions. No clipboard yet. No forms. Just permission to wander." That part was almost kind. The hallway beyond the lobby was wide and clean lined with framed prints of beaches and lighthouses, the kind of images that promise you rest. The first thing I noticed wasn't the decor, though. It was the waiting. Men and women sat in chairs along the walls, some with walkers parked neatly in front of them. Others with hands folded in their laps, as if they had been taught to make themselves small. A woman stared at the floor lips moving silently, maybe praying, maybe counting. A man with thick glasses watched the television, without blinking, the flickering light reflecting in his lenses like water. No one seemed to be going anywhere. A whiteboard hung on the wall with a list of activities written in bright marker. Chair yoga, bingo, movie afternoon. Under it, a calendar with big numbers and tiny names, birthdays marked with little smiley faces. Someone had written, "Happy Birthday, June." The handwriting was careful, like it mattered. Like someone wanted it to matter. I stood there longer than I meant to, reading the calendar, thinking about how a life can get reduced to a square on a wall and still be called care. I took a seat on one of the couches and waited just to see what would happen. Minutes passed. No one asked who I was. No one called a name. A nurse walked by, briskly, eyes on a tablet. An aide pushed a wheelchair, moving fast enough to suggest efficiency, slow enough to appear gentle. The people in the chairs watched them go, then looked away again. The waiting wasn't chaos. It was routine. Across from me, an older man sat hunched forward, hands gripping the arms of his chair like he was anchoring himself. His eyes followed every staff member who passed. He looked at me and smiled. "Doctor." I shook my head. "I'm not a doctor." He nodded anyway, as if my answer didn't matter. "You all look the same after a while," he said. "After a while, they stop telling you who they are." His voice wasn't angry. It was tired. Like he had said those words before, and no one had listened long enough to hear them. I felt a tightness in my chest. Not panic, something colder. Recognition. I stood and walked farther down the hall. Some doors were open, showing small rooms with identical furniture. A recliner, a bed, a dresser with a television remote placed neatly on top, as if tidiness could replace dignity. In one room, a woman slept in a chair with a blanket tucked around her legs, mouth slightly open. In another, a man stared out a window at a parking lot, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. For a moment, I saw Thomas Reed. Not literally, but the posture, the stillness, the way his shoulders had carried pride even when everything else had been taken away. I remembered visiting him outside Joliet, sitting by that window, whispering like the walls could report back to someone. "Frank, don't stay too long. They don't like it when you remind people they still have a life." Standing in Silver Pines. I understood what he meant. The danger here wasn't cruelty with sharp edges. It was kindness that erased you slowly. I turned back toward the lobby before anyone could stop me or steer me into a tour. At the front desk, the woman smiled again. "Did you find what you were looking for?" I met her eyes and kept my answer simple. "I'm still thinking." Outside, the air felt sharper, like my lungs remembered what it meant to be fully awake. I sat in my car for a moment, with my hands on the steering wheel, not starting the engine, letting the quiet settle. The lawn was green. The windows were clean. The sign was polished. And behind all of it was a system designed to make disappearance look like a responsible choice. When I got back to Manhattan later that afternoon, Daniel was waiting at Michael's apartment. He didn't ask if I was okay. He asked what I saw. I told him about the chairs along the hallway, the calendar, the man who called me doctor. I told him about the silence that felt organized. Daniel listened, then opened his folder and slid a few pages across the table. Not a stack, just enough. "These are complaint logs and reports from 2018 through 2023, he said. "Nothing that jumps off the page as a crime. Communication issues. Medication errors reported and addressed. Residents moved between rooms without clear explanation." He tapped a line with his finger. "This is how these cases usually look at first. Not like a horror story. Like paperwork." Michael leaned back in his chair. "That's the trap. Process." Daniel nodded. "There's also a connection worth noting. Mark Feldman, the administrator, has ties to a consulting firm your daughter-in-law worked with last year. It's not proof by itself, it is a thread." I thought of Paige in the kitchen, voice low, saying Silver Pines like she was ordering a service. So if I went there, I said it would all be proper. Daniel met my eyes. Proper. Documented. Justified. And very hard to undo once you're inside. I didn't feel angry. Anger would have burned off and left me exhausted. What I felt was resolve, steady and clear, the kind you get when you finally understand the structure of a problem. "No one gets to decide my life for me," I said. Daniel nodded once. "Then we make sure the decisions are yours, and we make sure the record shows it." I walked to the window and looked down at the city grid below. People moved with purpose even when they didn't know it. Cars stopped and started. Lights changed. The whole place operated on rules. I thought about the basement room in Naperville, about being given an hour like I was a delivery that needed to be scheduled, about how close I had come to being guided into a building like Silver Pines and called safe while my name faded from everyone's mouth. When I turned back to the table, my voice didn't shake. Whatever comes next, I want to see it coming. Michael's expression didn't change, but I saw approval in the stillness. "Then we move forward," he said, and as the late afternoon light thinned across the glass, I knew one thing with a certainty I hadn't felt in years. I was not going to vanish quietly. The certainty didn't make me feel strong. It made me feel awake. That night, I lay on Michael's guest bed and listened to the city breathe through the window glass. Sirens far off. A horn here and there. The kind of noise that reminds you the world keeps moving, whether you are ready or not. I should have slept, but my mind kept returning to Tyler's face on the porch. Not the anger, the confusion underneath it. Like he had thrown a punch and didn't recognize his own arm. By morning, I knew I couldn't build the next step on guesses. If I was going to protect my life, I needed to know whether my son was choosing this, or whether he had been pushed into it until it felt like his idea. Either way, he was responsible. But responsibility and hatred are two different things. I texted him a simple message. "Meet me alone." Coffee. 1 hour. He didn't answer right away. An hour later, his reply came through. Noon. Cornerstone Coffee in Downers Grove. Cornerstone was the kind of place people used when they wanted to talk without anyone hearing, but also without anyone asking why. Big windows, light wood tables, the smell of espresso and sugar. A few older men in work boots sitting with laptops they barely touched. A young mom rocking a stroller with one foot. Ordinary life moving on. I arrived early and chose a table near the back where I could see the door without looking like I was watching it. I ordered black coffee and kept my hands around the warm cup until my breathing slowed. When Tyler walked in, I felt a small jolt in my chest. Not anger, grief. He looked older than 41. Not in years, but in weight. His shoulders were pulled tight, his jaw set, eyes tired in a way sleep never fixes. He scanned the room once, then spotted me and came over. He stood beside the chair for a second, like he wasn't sure he still had a place at my table. I nodded toward the seat. "Sit." He sat and immediately clasped his hands together, then unclasped them, then clasped them again. I had seen that habit before, years ago, when he was a boy, and had broken something he didn't want to admit he'd touched. I didn't start with the kitchen. I started with my granddaughter. "How's Emma?" He blinked, caught off guard. "She's fine," he said. "She's at school." "Good," I said. He stared at the table, then finally looked up. "Dad." I didn't know Michael was going to show up like that. I let the words hang for a moment. "You mean you didn't know I wasn't going to stand on that porch and beg?" I said. His face tightened. "That's not what I meant." I took a slow sip of coffee. "Then say what you mean." Tyler exhaled like he'd been holding his breath since yesterday. "We were trying to do what made sense," he said. "Things are hard right now. Everything costs more. The mortgage, the taxes, groceries, Emma's stuff. I'm always behind." Hard sounded reasonable. It always does. Hard is the word people use to make cruelty feel like math. I leaned forward slightly. Hard doesn't give you the right to talk to me like I'm a burden you can relocate. His eyes flickered, then looked away toward the front counter, where a barista was calling out names. For a second, it seemed like he wanted the noise of the place to drown out the truth. He spoke again, quieter. "Paige thinks in plans. She always has. She gets scared and she turns fear into a checklist." I watched him. "And you let her turn me into an item on it." Tyler's throat worked. I didn't know what else to do. I felt something sharp behind my ribs. Not rage. A memory. Tyler at 10 years old standing beside me near a construction site fence wearing a plastic hard hat I'd bought him at a hardware store. He was grinning like he belonged there. He asked me why men had to tie rebar the way they did. Because if you cut corners now, I told him, the cracks show up later. Always. I remembered the way he nodded, serious, as if he understood something about the world that mattered. Now he sat across from me, grown with cracks spreading through his voice. "You could have told me the truth," I said. He looked up fast. "What truth?" "That you were scared," I said. "That you were drowning. That you needed help. Not that you needed to get rid of me." His eyes flashed with frustration, then softened into something closer to shame. "I didn't want Emma to see us falling apart," he said. There it was. The part that sounded like fatherhood, even when it was used as a weapon. I kept my tone calm. "And you thought the best way to protect her was to erase me." Tyler shook his head once. "It wasn't like that." I didn't argue the wording. I stayed with the reality. "You know what I heard yesterday, Tyler? I heard my son tell me I either go to a nursing home or get out of his house." He swallowed. "I know." I waited. I gave him room to step into his own responsibility. He didn't. Not fully. He rubbed his forehead. "Paige kept saying assisted living was safer. She said you could fall. She said if something happened, we'd be blamed. She said it would be better for everyone." Better for everyone. I stared at him and felt the grief settle deeper. "I'm not a package you can ship to a facility when life gets inconvenient," I said. He flinched as if I'd raised my voice. I hadn't. Then I asked the question that had been building in me since the basement, since the whisper of silver pines, since the thought of Thomas Reed behind glass. If I disappear in a nursing home, does that make your life lighter? Or does it just mean you don't have to see me? Tyler's hands went still. He stared at the table as if the wood grain could give him an answer that wouldn't stain him. His mouth opened, then closed. His throat moved. No words came. The espresso machine hissed at the front counter. Someone laughed too loudly near the window. The world stayed ordinary, while my son failed to speak. That silence wasn't just guilt. It was fear. Fear of admitting the ugliest truth. That he had wanted relief more than he had wanted my dignity. I stood up slowly. Not in anger. In clarity. Tyler looked up, eyes wet, but controlled the way men try to keep themselves from falling apart in public. "Dad," he started. I held up a hand not to silence him, but to steady the moment. "I'm not here to beg," I said. "I'm here to tell you this. You don't get to take my life apart because you're afraid of your own future." His face tightened. Shame and longing mixed together. For a second I saw the boy again. The one in the plastic hard hat. The one who believed a man's word mattered. That made it hurt more, not less. I set cash on the table, more than enough for the coffee, because some habits are how I keep my footing. Then I walked out. The air outside was cold and clean. I crossed the parking lot with my hands in my coat pockets, breathing slowly, forcing my shoulders to stay relaxed. My phone vibrated. A message from Tyler. "Dad, please. Just tell me what you're going to do next." I didn't stop walking, but the question followed me all the way to my car, and I knew it wasn't only my son who was about to find out. I drove back to the city, with my son's question still vibrating in my pocket like an ache. "What are you going to do next?" By the time I reached Michael's building, the answer was already forming. Not revenge, not cruelty, structure, boundaries, paper that couldn't be argued with. I had spent my life building things that held up under stress. This was no different except the load was my own blood. Daniel was at Michael's table when I walked in, jacket off sleeves rolled a folder open in front of him. Michael stood near the window with a phone pressed to his ear, speaking low, measured, as if he was arranging logistics for a project, not untangling a family. Daniel looked up when I entered. "How did it go?" I set my keys down and didn't sit right away. "It went the way it had to," I said. He couldn't answer. Daniel nodded once. No judgment, just acknowledgement. "Then we proceed," he said. "Carefully, legally, and without theatrics." That was exactly what I wanted. No shouting matches, no porch speeches, no public humiliation. Those things make you feel powerful for 10 minutes and weak for 10 years. Daniel slid a single page across the table. "This is a revocation of the power of attorney. We will get it notarized today. Then we notify the parties who matter. Your bank, any investment accounts, any medical providers on file. We also request copies of any transactions made under that authority." I picked up the paper and scanned it. The words were plain. Clinical. The kind of language that doesn't care about feelings, only facts. Michael ended his call and joined us. "Frank," he said once this is filed, "Tyler can't walk into a bank and speak for you. That door closes." I nodded slowly. Closing doors was always harder than opening them. But some doors should never have been unlocked. Daniel kept his tone steady. "Next, we request financial transparency from Tyler in his role as trustee manager. He may not like it. He may claim it's an attack. But if the trust was established to protect you, then the manager has responsibilities, records, accountability." I sat down finally and felt the weight settle into my shoulders. Not fear, fatigue. "And Silver Pines?" I asked. Daniel slid another sheet over. "We file a complaint with the Illinois Department of Public Health. Not a dramatic accusation. A request for review based on a pattern of complaints and potential conflicts of interest. We also request their admissions procedures and any communications logs related to your name." The word communications made my stomach tighten. Paige's phone. The whisper in the kitchen. The appointment she thought I didn't hear. Daniel watched my face. "This does not mean the state rushes in tomorrow and shuts the place down," he said. "This takes time, but it starts pressure, and pressure forces people to make mistakes." That was the first time I felt something close to satisfaction. Not because anyone would suffer, because truth, when it has weight behind it, tends to surface. Over the next few days, nothing exploded. There were no sirens at Tyler's door, no courtroom drama, just phone calls, emails, certified letters that required signatures. But I could feel the tension tightening like a cable being drawn taut. Tyler called me once. I didn't answer. Not to punish him, because I knew my voice would either soften and undo everything or harden and say something I couldn't take back. I let it go to voicemail. His message was short and strained. "Dad, Daniel called. What is this? Why are you doing this?" I listened twice, then deleted it. Paige called next. I recognized the number and let it ring. She didn't leave a message the first time. The second time, she did, her tone crisp, controlled, already building a narrative. "Frank, you are making a mistake. You are turning this into a legal situation when it never had to be. We were trying to make sure you were cared for. You're letting people manipulate you." People. She meant Michael. She meant Daniel. She meant anyone who threatened her control. Daniel listened to the voicemail beside me and didn't flinch. "She's building a record," he said. She wants to sound reasonable if this goes further. Michael's eyes stayed on the city outside. Reasonable people don't schedule an old man's disappearance, he said quietly. The pressure started showing up in places I didn't expect. One afternoon, Daniel received an email from Page's consulting firm. Not from Page directly. It was a notice. Her contract with a regional healthcare marketing client had been terminated. No details. Just a polite sentence about changes in business needs. Daniel printed it and slid it across the table. This is what happens when suspicion enters the room, he said. People back away. They do not want their names near potential elder abuse investigations. It wasn't justice. Not yet. But it was consequence. A day later, a letter arrived for Tyler. Certified. Daniel had arranged for copies to be sent to Michael's address, not mine. For my protection. For distance. The letter outlined Tyler's duties as trustee manager. Requests for accountings. A reminder of fiduciary responsibility. The words were firm without being cruel. That evening, Tyler called again. This time I answered because I heard something in the ring, a desperation that felt less like anger and more like panic. "Dad," he said, voice tight, "Paige is losing her mind. She says you're trying to take everything from us." I kept my voice low. "I'm not taking anything, Tyler. I'm taking my life back." He breathed hard into the phone. "The bank called. They asked about transactions. They asked why your accounts are being flagged. They asked about the trust." I could picture him at his kitchen island, the same place he had told me to leave, holding a phone like it was heavier than it should be. Daniel's words came back to me. Pressure forces mistakes. Tyler spoke again, quieter now. "What did Paige tell you? What did you hear?" I closed my eyes. "I heard enough," I said, "and I saw silver pines with my own eyes." There was a long pause. Then Tyler's voice, smaller than I had ever heard it. "I didn't want that, Dad. I didn't argue. I didn't console him. I said the truth that mattered. Then you should have stopped it." I ended the call before my own voice could change. That night, I sat alone in the guest room and opened my suitcase. I hadn't fully unpacked since the day I left. Part of me still felt like I was living in transition, like a man waiting to see where he would be allowed to land. At the bottom, beneath the sweater and the folded shirts, was an old photo I had slipped in without thinking. Tyler, at 8 years old. A plastic hard hat on his head. Dirt on his cheeks. His grin wide and fearless. He was standing beside me at a construction site fence, looking through the chain links at men moving steel, convinced the world was something you could build with your hands. I held the photo and felt the tiredness in my bones. The legal steps were moving now. The pressure was real. Consequences were beginning to show their edges. But looking at that boy, I understood something that made my throat tighten. Whatever came next, there was no going back to how it used to be. The next few months did not feel like victory. They felt like recovery after a storm, when you walk outside and see what is still standing and what has been ripped out by the roots. I did not go back to Naperville. Not to that brick house, not to that basement room, not to the porch where my son learned how easy it was to hand me an ultimatum. Michael helped me find a small apartment on the edge of Oak Park, close enough to familiar streets, that I could breathe again, far enough that I would not run into my old life every time I bought groceries. It was a one-bedroom with decent light and a kitchen that smelled like my own coffee. The first night I slept there, I woke up at 3 a.m. and listened for footsteps above me, then remembered there were none. Daniel moved with steady patience. The revocation of the power of attorney was filed, notarized, and sent everywhere it needed to go. The bank stopped calling Tyler and started calling me. Doctors stopped taking updates from anyone but me. It was strange how quickly dignity returns when the paperwork lines up behind it. The trust situation did not resolve in a single dramatic moment. It turned into meetings, phone calls, and uncomfortable conversations that Tyler could not talk his way out of. Daniel arranged for an independent fiduciary to review the accounts not because I wanted to punish my son, but because I needed truth to be something more than a feeling. That review found what I expected and what I did not. There were charges that did not belong. Small at first, then larger. Consulting invoices tied to Paige. Fees that looked like normal household expenses until you stared at the dates and realized they spiked every time Paige said we needed to tighten up. It was not a crime that would make the news. It was the kind of abuse that thrives in the space between family and law where people assume love will cover the gaps. Paige did not go down in flames. She disappeared the way she always tried to make others disappear quietly, and with a story ready in case anyone asked. Her consulting contracts dried up when the complaint against Silver Pines triggered the kind of questions companies do not like. She blamed me. She blamed Michael. She blamed Daniel. In the end, she blamed Tyler most of all. Tyler told me later that the night everything cracked, she stood in their kitchen and said she could not live like this with everyone watching with him, too weak to protect his own home. She packed a suitcase and left before sunrise. He did not chase her. I wish I could tell you that was satisfying. It was not. It was simply what happens when a person who needs control loses it. Tyler started therapy in late spring. He did not tell me right away. I heard it through Daniel, then through a short text from Tyler that read, "I am trying." That was all. No apology big enough to erase what he had said. No explanation that could unring a bell. We met again, not in a coffee shop, but in a small office with a counselor who spoke softly and asked hard questions. Tyler looked smaller in that chair than he had on the porch, and not because he was afraid of me, because he was finally afraid of himself. He said he hated that he had become the kind of man who could look at his own father and see a problem to solve. He said Paige had been feeding a fear he already carried, the fear that he would fail his daughter the way he believed he had failed me. He said he did not know how to hold everything at once: money, marriage, fatherhood, and the slow truth of aging, and he chose the easiest path: remove the weight. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I did not reach across the space and tell him it was okay. It was not okay. But I also did not turn away. I told him the boundary. You can be in my life, Tyler, but you will not manage it. You will not speak for me. You will not decide where I live, who I see, or what I do with what I earned. He nodded as if each word stung, and maybe it should have. The one thing I refused to lose was my granddaughter. Her full name is Olivia Hale, but she has always gone by Emma at home, a nickname Paige liked when she was still trying to make the family look perfect. She came to my apartment for the first time on a Saturday afternoon, holding a small bag of coloring books and wearing sneakers that lit up when she ran. Tyler brought her, stayed only a few minutes, then left us alone. That choice mattered. It told me he was learning to let go of control. Emma walked through my living room and looked at the framed photo of me in a hard hat, then looked up at me with that blunt honesty kids carry like a gift. "Grandpa, why don't you live with us anymore?" I knelt slow, careful with my knees and met her eyes. "Because grown-ups sometimes make choices that hurt," I said, "and sometimes we have to make choices that keep us safe." She thought about that for a long moment, then asked if I still knew how to make grilled cheese the way I used to. I laughed, and the sound surprised me. It had been a while since laughter came without bitterness. We cooked together. We spilled a little. She drew on the back of an old envelope and taped it to my fridge like it was an award. When she left, the apartment felt quiet again, but it no longer felt empty. That is what I chose to keep. Not the house in Naperville. Not the illusion that family will always protect you just because you share blood. Not the need to win at all costs. I kept my right to decide. I kept my name. I kept my ability to look at my son and see both the man who hurt me and the boy I raised without letting either one erase the truth. Some nights I still think about Silver Pines, about the calendar with birthdays written in careful handwriting, about the man who called me doctor because he had stopped expecting anyone to explain themselves. I think about how close I came to becoming another quiet figure in a hallway, waiting to be called, waiting to matter. Then I make coffee in my own kitchen, and I listen to the city outside my window, and I remember that disappearing is not always an accident. Sometimes it is a plan. And the only way to stop it is to refuse to cooperate with your own erasure. If this story hit you somewhere personal, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly. If your child looked you in the eye one day and said you either enter a nursing home or you leave my house, what would you have in place so you do not vanish? Tell me in the comments what you would do and what you have already done to make sure your life stays yours.